Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. Well, it's again one of those full circle moments, and it happened exactly as we expected. A total backfire, a total FAFO. Remember when Canada was standing up against the United States and Donald Trump's economic bullying? Remember when the entire American lamestream media sided with a foreign nation, multiple foreign nations at that, basically took the side of Canada, declared they had the moral high ground and they were just victims in all this, and that picking a battle with them would somehow backfire on America? Well, of course, the whole notion was laughable from the start, and of course, I, as well as everybody else with above room temperature IQ, we all made the prediction that this would backfire, and well, would you look at that, here we are, Canada comes right back to point zero, back to square one. In fact, you'd even say square -5 at this point, as they've now negotiated themselves backwards into a worse position than they were initially. I guess they didn't have that much leverage after all, despite the left-wing media fantasies. Canadian leadership has completely painted itself into a corner, and now they're desperately scrambling to fix what they have broken, begging for forgiveness, begging for another chance, and Donald Trump just told them to take a hike, completely ghosting, standing up the Canadian diplomatic envoy. What a complete utter failure and embarrassment Canadian leadership continues to be. Let's take a look at what's going on between the two budding nations, shall we? We got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. Alright folks, so it seems as though, Canada made a severe miscalculation here. I think they were suffering through a little episode of main character syndrome. They made one severe mistake, thinking they were special. Obviously, there was an assumption here that I guess they'd be exempt from the America First agenda, or I guess they even took it as far to make it seem as if they were being singled out. Ooh, Donald Trump is just bullying poor old Canada because he's a fascist tyrant who's doing exactly what Vladimir Putin's doing. He wants to annex a neighboring nation to increase his scope of power. But the reality was, despite the memes and the rhetoric, they were getting the same treatment as everybody else, and rightfully so. Donald Trump's been on this America First agenda for a long time. He's been talking about trade deficits for a long time, as well as unfair trade practices. And when it came to the trading and diplomatic relationship between his administration and the Canadian government, well, he had some issues. He had some grievances, some gripes. And he's made that known, and they've had a whole lot of time to address those legitimate issues. But the Canadian government, I guess, was just hoping that Kamala Harris was gonna win. They were betting on the YouGov polls, and so they dragged their feet, and of course predicated an entire election based on this Trump-deranged notion of standing up to Donald Trump. They put themselves in a box and, well, now they're getting buried in it. Yeah, let's just say it's not going so well.
You were just here in Washington negotiating, and while the talks are officially continuing, you left town without a deal, and you left town with now what is a 35% tariff on goods. How much of a setback was the president's decision to do that while you are still at the table?
We were obviously disappointed by that decision. We believe there's a great deal of common ground between the United States and Canada in terms of building two strong economies that work well together. That's been the history of the 40-year free trade agreement that goes back to President Reagan. We were pleased the United States is respecting the terms of the USMCA agreement. That's vital, we think, to the cost of living and affordability, certainly in the United States. It's true in Canada as well.
You heard Ambassador Greer say because Canada retaliated to the initial tariffs, so all the way back in April when Prime Minister Trudeau was in office, you're paying the price now, even though you have a new government in place. If that's the issue, why not make that concession and pull back?
Prime Minister Carney, our new Prime Minister, has, we think, built a very business-like, respectful relationship with President Trump. We think that's obviously very important to Canada, and we think to the United States. Are
there any plans for the two leaders to speak? I saw President Trump said your prime minister called him Thursday and they just never connected. I mean, are tensions that high? And given the changing justification for the tariffs, do you really feel like you're negotiating with the other side in good faith?
Of course we do. As I say, the conversations have been informative, constructive, and cordial. I would expect the Prime Minister will have a conversation with the President over the next number of days. That's certainly my plan, again, with Secretary Lutnick, recognizing that We think there is an option of striking a deal that will bring down some of these tariffs, provide greater certainty to investment.
Oh, it could have been so simple. And it's not like they weren't warned. All this talk of, oh, America's best friend, closest ally, greatest trading partner, only then to act like illogical, petulant children. It could have been so frickin' easy. Just address the issues, northern security in the Arctic, get migration under control so it's not spilling over the northern border, open up your markets and stop with the protectionist, so-called dairy mafia supply management cartel, help us deal with the fentanyl crisis, take it seriously. And of course the whole Huawei scandal and all the stories revolving around the Chinese government embedding itself within Canada's governmental power structure. Just come to the table and engage in good faith on these legitimate issues that President Trump has been signaling frustration over for a long time. But instead, what did we get? The most over-dramatic, illogical, emotional crap. Every politician running to the cameras, crying about being bullied by Donald Trump. Donald Trump stole my lunch and kicked me in the butt. How could anyone support this monster? Oh, they ran for those cameras. It seemed like they were feeding off potential economic pain and butting heads with President Trump because it gave them some sort of fake moral high ground that they could then grandstand on. You know, really whip up the boomer generation to tap into their inner 1970s hippie and really stick it to the man. In other words, scoring cheap points against the big orange man, I guess, became all the rage, but at the cost of what? And especially given the timing, Canada's own central bank is telling the people that the Canadian economy is teetering on the edge.
At this rate decision, there was a clear consensus to hold our policy rate unchanged. We also agreed that we need to proceed carefully with particular attention to the risks and uncertainties facing the Canadian economy. If a weakening economy puts further downward pressure on inflation and the upward price pressures from trade disruption are contained, there may be a need for a reduction in the policy interest rate. So far, the global economic consequences of U.S. trade policy have been less severe than feared. In Canada, we had robust growth in the first quarter of 2025, mostly because firms were rushing to get ahead of tariffs. In the second quarter, the economy looks to have contracted as exports to the United States have fallen sharply, both as payback for the pull forward and because tariffs are dampening U.S. demand for our goods. Turning to inflation, CPI inflation has been pulled down by the elimination of the carbon tax and is just below 2%. However, a range of indicators suggest underlying inflation has increased from about 2% in the second half of last year to around 2.5% more recently. This largely reflects an increase in non-energy goods prices. Shelter cost inflation remains the biggest contributor to CPI inflation, but it continues to ease. The unemployment rate has moved up modestly to 6.9%.
The country's at the weakest point in decades, arguably maybe even over the last century. And their genius idea was to provoke a trade war with their largest economic partner for political brownie points. Absolute delusion, all driven by this obsessive, irrational hatred for Donald Trump and frankly for America. Anti-American culture has been totally exposed, and it's no wonder that kind of toxic thinking is now backfiring. Standing up for Canada. Yeah, more like standing in the middle of a road, begging to be hit by a roaring truck. It's weird because this Trump-deranged resistance culture seems to be built on the basis of Canadian patriotism, right? We're patriots standing up against this American tyrant. But really, the patriotic thing is doing what's right for your country, not sending your country into a damn volcano so you could pretend to act tough on Facebook. They've totally exposed themselves and isolated themselves, which is kind of ironic because they told you that Donald Trump, the big mean guy, well, he's gonna alienate the world, and we're gonna side with China in a new global realignment away from American influence. Just think about that. First of all, totally naive and ridiculous, and secondly, unappreciative after everything America's done for all of these nations, for the world. I mean, Canada is basically subsidized by being in close proximity to America, they've ran a pretty clean budget over the last couple of decades while having enough money to fund the very generous social programs they offer. But guess what? All these decades, they've never had to pay for defense because it was just assumed that Big Brother America would defend them. Well, now all of a sudden, they're headed towards massive fiscal deficit territory as Donald Trump is now demanding they fund their own national defense. Yeah, when you've been in that privileged situation for decades and you've been able to benefit from it, and then at some point that neighboring country comes and says, listen, we've got a couple issues, can you work with us on them? Your response should be, thanks for everything and absolutely, what can we do to help? But instead the Canadian response was, we're going to replace you with China and Europe, hit you with retaliatory tariffs, we're going to run to the media and constantly talk crap about your leader, and then when it all goes sideways, we're going to cynically take advantage of that and play the victim. I mean, come on. Textbook manipulative narcissism. I've never seen anything like it. But of course, in the end, it backfired. They mocked President Trump, they retaliated, they flirted with turning the entire world against America, and in the end, they've totally isolated themselves and are now facing a historic level recession. You know, I think there's actually a known phenomenon playing out here. It's called the Trump curse. Those who know, know.